Good morning YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Sunday morning, 1.5 degrees outside. So the outsiders and first dog on the moon are once again coming from inside the hut.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not. And we are, as ever, obliged to Barry and impressed too that he would, for the second week running, break his long service leave to give us those few words. Your Outsiders this morning are writer and editor Alex Gorman, editor of a new site for the Mamma Mia network that remains something of a mystery, advertising creative Dee Madigan, and writer and social commentator Eva Cox. Welcome to you all.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's budget, to be interrupted only by Commission of Audit. Here's a little reminder of the events of the past few days.
What this report proves is that we have inherited a mess. The challenge now is to get on with the job of fixing the mess, and we will.
This is a report written by big business, for big business, that will hurt hard-working families.
We hope, though, that it will inform their future strategy, I think, on things like, people having to look after themselves, cutting down corporate and personal welfare, the state's relationship, all of those things, having a good fiscal strategy for the future. I think that's really the main thrust of our report, and we hope they adopt that in a philosophical sense.
And there's Tony Shepherd at the end there, the man behind or leading the Commission of Audit. Well, I think, Eva, my favourite bit of audio from the past week was Matthias Cormann, who finally got in on the joke and did the "I'll be back," which for me was, I think, a golden moment. Eva, we're seeing the result in the polling already, that the Coalition's two-party preferred vote is tumbling. That's 72%, according to the News Limited tabloids this morning.
Well, that's going to be interesting, yes.
Yes, so I mean, that would not be an unpredicted consequence, I suspect, of the sort of policy they're talking.
Yes, I'd be interested to see exactly what question they ask, since that's one of my areas, because I think a lot of it's actually about the undermining of the whole idea of the social contract, the whole way suddenly Medicare's under threat, everything's under threat, and we've got just this whole sense that this is really the tail end of a change that's been happening for the last 30 years, where we've gradually undermined a very basic Australian idea, which is that concept of the fair go, the country where we do the right thing by other people, and where government is a partner in that process, not the sort of residual waste paper basket that picks up the people that can't manage the market. And that's the idea behind this. I think it was Ellen Fanning that made the comment saying this might look much more like a benevolent or maybe a malevolent sort of dictatorship from business rather than a serious attempt at any sort of political change. And I think that that's probably not a bad thing. I mean, we have to decide whether or not the country that started the idea of the basic wage, that actually had one of the first pension systems in the world, that actually built into it that sort of whole concept of mateship, even if we did leave out Indigenous people and Asians and a few others. But that's very much part of the ethos, and you can't find that anywhere in this particular report. It's all about unfairness. It's all about redistributing, not to working families, but to people who outside the workforce are completely stuffed by this one because they're just seen as non-people.
And isn't this the problem, Dee Madigan, that everything Eva says there is based on this Commission of Audit report that the government says is simply a report to government? And yet, I think we've all formed this impression that, well, it's perhaps more than that, that there is a sense in which that this is part of the government's wish list too. I mean, that sort of blurring is awkward, I would have thought, Dee, for the government.
Yeah, particularly with the revelations this week from ICAC about Tony Shepherd's donations to the Liberal Party. There's certainly a connection there, and this is part of their narrative, really, that we need a smaller government, that people need to step up, and that somehow people who are on welfare really don't deserve a lot. And the fact that they've put things in there like, indexing the minimum wage below CPI, it doesn't actually need to be in there because it's not a government expenditure, and it is one of the ways that we can just see how nasty this is, and leaving off things like superannuation tax breaks for wealthy people while effectively pushing the value of pensions down 17%. says here that this is not about people sharing the load. This is about impacting on the people who can least afford it.
And yet a certain self-consciousness, Alex, to bring you in here on that sense of fairness with the debt tax being aimed at higher income earning Australians, if $80,000 a year is higher income earning. Is the game of budget expectation management been a little bit fumbled here? We're all going to be pleasantly surprised on Tuesday week, but will this impression linger? Will we have a sense that this is what's still in mind, whatever the budget might hold?
Yes, I think we've got this report that's called Towards Responsible Government, but what it's actually showing is that the government doesn't want to be responsible for anything anymore. And I think that it is a big, scary thing to kind of terrify us ahead of the budget. And then when the budget does come out, it will be far, far less extreme. But, before the election we were talking about the Abbot Liberal Party as being a party with no policies, and here we have this giant ideological screed that shows exactly the kind of policies we can look towards in the future from them.
That's an interesting point, I think, Eva, is the influence of people with fairly strong ideology on the government's approach. And the government, like any Australian government, is basically a creature of the centre ground.
Well, it's doubtful whether it is in this particular case. It seems to be moving further and further to the right, which is partly because the opposition has moved so far to the right that in order to be right-wing, the coalition has to move even further to the right, so that they're all scrambling. So Malcolm Fraser looks like a bleeding heart radical compared to any of them. So I think that's a really neat way of sort of looking at it. But I think the point about this exercise is that they're not going to do some of the worst things within it. But the fact that they could actually commission this report and accept it and sit on it for 2 months and then release it just before the budget stuff, strikes me that this is the golem, this is the evil giant that's going to scare the children before they tell us a reassuring bedside story saying they're not going to be nearly as bad. But I think it does undermine people's sense that government is there for us. It's only there for those people who can't afford the private sector. And the Medicare, at the attempt to sort of undermine the idea of a universal health system, I think is deeply insulting to people, plus undermining, the minimum wage. These really are assaults on something that sort of is deep in the Australian sort of voter psyche, that these are things that we do for everybody. And I think that that's one of the areas where I think they might have gone too far, which might, show that the news poll, or whatever it is, one of the
Galaxy,
the Galaxy poll, actually is showing a deep sense of unease about where we're going because they've gone a bit too far.
And we expected there to be, in the pre-budget, there's a whole lot of stuff run up the flag, and we've been seeing that now for months with things like co-payments and so forth. Is this just a slightly overplaying of that particular strategy?
I think what they've done is they've played a strategy, a very old-fashioned strategy, and they haven't taken into account social media. It used to be, you came out with some fairly awful things, but you set up the debates you wanted to have in the mainstream media prior to the budget, and in this case it was about things like fiscal equality and who controls what in terms of state and government. But basically they've spent the past 2 weeks, and will spend the time up to the budget, putting out spot fires. And it even to be discussing cuts that Tony Abbott absolutely categorically ruled out before the election, whether they happen or not, makes him look tricky. So that he's lost a lot of political credibility over this regardless of what happens. They've completely, I think, lost control of the narrative leading up to the budget, which is why I suspect he's staying in Australia while going overseas, although I suspect he's better off overseas because I think Matthias Cormann is probably the only one who seems to be cutting through in the media.
He'll be back.
He will be.
This is an interesting thing, Alex, because I think the whole idea of controlling the message is, as we know, a really, really difficult thing in these times when everybody has a finger on the levers of information. I mean, the part of it that perhaps they have controlled even less than this runaway consequence of the Commission of Audit is pitching to us the seriousness of the problem. Are we convinced by that?
No, I don't think we are convinced, and it's difficult to be convinced of the seriousness of a problem that's essentially a made-up problem. I think more Australians than they would hope are aware that our spending is actually pretty low by OECD standards, and that our debt is pretty low as well. So telling us that we're so badly off that things are going to be catastrophic soon, when we can just look around and see what our neighbours and see what our peers is doing is completely different. Is just preposterous.
And yet there are structural issues. You know, the revenue is in decline. It is not paying for what we want. The IMF says that, okay, our debt is low by comparative standards, but the rate at which that is increasing is the biggest in the world.
Yes, but I mean, what we need to remember, and remember quite clearly, which was not pointed out very much this week, which is the fact is that they haven't done the revenue side at all.
Yes.
That's supposed to be coming out in a white paper. The fact that there's $120 billion in tax expenditures, which is tax that we don't collect, is actually a sign that there's a hell of a lot of money there, most of which goes to the rich, including all those superannuation tax concessions that cost more than the age pension, which they're trying to cut. That they, you know, that these have been completely ignored, and I think that that sort of adds to it. And certainly every reputable sort of economist commentator that's made in these things, none of them have said that we really have a crisis, but that we need to look at the revenue side, and you can blame that partly on the Howard tax cuts and partly on the Labor Party spending and partly on other things, but that's not a problem. We can find 60 or 70 billion out of those areas if we want to, without sort of persecuting the poor and the unemployed, which actually gain us very little. But I also noticed actually one of the points I pulled out, which hasn't been mentioned, is the Illegal Maritime Act cost, where there's a nice $3 billion or so sitting there for all those people sitting in the camps. Why doesn't anybody ever suggest we cut those if they're serious about cutting?
Well, and this is the thing, Dee, sorry to cut off there, but this is the thing the government has to look forward to. Once it hoses down this whole thing of cuts and slashes, it has a tax policy discussion to enter into, which is, you know, with a white paper due and with all the subsequent talking about that leading up to the next poll. I mean, this is a succession of minefields for this government.
Well, I mean, an interesting
they should have combined the two things together, I think, and helped sell a message that, you know, everyone is doing their heavy lifting. But I also bring up the point, they haven't looked at ASIO. Now, their budget has doubled in the past 10 years, and yet that was completely left off the Commission of Audit, and that is a massive government expenditure.
Yes, there were a few things out. I mean, we have things like Joint Strike Fighters, for example, which is not of insignificant expense, which is unfortunate timing, I guess.
Yeah, I wonder how many pensions they cover.
Many, many, many. And I mean, what are we going to do with 48 planes against the rest of the world? But that's another question. But one of the points that I think that we do need to look at, which is quite interesting, is a reaction to the so-called deficit tax thing, which is the only area where they've suggested that maybe better off people, you know, that the government suggested they might tax better off people, and you made the comment earlier about 80,000 is not a very high income. It actually is. It's in the top 30% of incomes approximately in Australia. People forget that average weekly earnings actually covers the, you know, is more than the bottom 7%. Median earnings, which is way much lower, is actually the half point, not average weekly earnings. So it's 80,000 people, individuals on 80,000 are not badly paid and could probably pay more tax.
But it probably points to the disadvantage of people under that sort of level of income as much as anything else, because 80,000 in today's world is not a lot to get high on.
Well, it's actually not exactly penury. You should try the other end of it. Try getting, 18 or 13,000, which is what we do with it. But I think the point about it is that, you know, the distribution of taxes has been increasingly unfair. We've cut the $180,000 thing down to under 50%. We have no wealth taxes. I mean, one of the things I'm suggesting is instead of trying to cut pensions, why don't we introduce death taxes? I mean, they're much harder to get away from and avoid.
Yeah, also failing to make international corporations pay their dues. I mean, it was revealed this week that Google, who earned $2 billion in advertising revenue from Australian markets, paid only $500,000 in tax this year.
There's plenty of opportunities for tightening up on revenue, to be sure. I mean, the other side of this is, and then Tony Abbott wrote the playbook on how a situation like this should be dealt with breaches of promises and so forth. How well or otherwise is Bill Shorten seizing this opportunity?
In a way, he doesn't really need to seize it that well, because the Australian public has. And Tony Abbott, when he really hammered the previous government on lying and calling a tax a levy and things like that. So this has all come around to bite him. So I think his real problem with the deficit levy is that it's a breach of promise rather than any sort of thing about how much it's actually going to cost. I think when you've got News Limited headlines running, you know, the big economy myth, there is no crisis in Australia, you're in serious trouble for a Conservative government.
Yes, perhaps they will be able to make up their own minds without political intervention. Look, interesting budget period ahead of us, to be certain, and thanks to our outsiders this morning, they've been.
Okay, going to be a separate movie for First Dog on the Moon.